sharp blade cutting once could achieve more than a dull one sawing endlessly.
The House at Lane's End. Springer, 1861. At the end of the lane stood our house like a punctuation mark that had not been asked whether it belonged there. It was no full stop, rather a semicolon that separated the fields from the rest of the village without quite ending what had been said before. The gable faced north, as though it wished to meet the wind head-on. The roof had an inclination that decided the rain swiftly, the eaves carrying the collected wrath of clouds in an even drip line. Early I learnt roofs are schools of consequence. He who cuts poorly learns to remain wet. The lane was a thin thread of earth and stone. In spring it began to breathe. Water stood in the hollows. Sky appeared therein in trembling patches. Cowprints transformed into maps with islands where no one wished to dwell. When the baker's cart passed, the world shifted by a finger's width. The spokes washed the sky, and light rose in spatters against the low walls. One could stand and count time merely by listening to drops falling from the moss. Our house was narrow, a pair of parentheses that left just enough air between them for a family to pass through. The door was of wood that sang in winter. One heard it when frost crept into the grain and tugged at it with small voices. The bolt was of iron that promised honesty. It held when it held, and betrayed it with a sound that said, now. When it did not hold, it was no one's fault. Merely metal reminded of its age. I measured the house by its sounds. The stair gave way in the middle, at the 5th step from above, and complained at the 3rd from below. The half had 2 breaths, a heavy one when one fed it, and a long one when it was satisfied. The roof answered rain with an approving nod in the rafters. At night, when all slept, the wall beside my bed spoke its own quiet language. Mortar settling. Traces of small feet behind the skirting that the wood had not made tight enough. I listened to the house, and knew where it was old and where it merely pretended to be. The hall was narrow as a thought one cannot speak aloud. The floorboards bore notches at regular intervals, as though someone with patience and a knife had set about marking time. I counted them, naturally. There were 30 to the kitchen and 14 to the stairs. When one drew a finger along the wall, one felt the rough seams of plaster. Not beautiful, but honest. In the small window to the yard hung a curtain Mother had sewn from remnants, cream-colored with an edge that had once been blue. The edge pretended to hold the light fast. That was a lie, but a harmless one.
Oh, where are my manners? My name is Grimwick. And that was just one page of tonight's diary.
The education of observation. The kitchen smelled of the absence of grand meals, of tallow, of lye, of bread that was scarcer than our hunger. There was a table with a notch that ran the length of a thumb, and when I placed my thumb within it, I felt that it belonged precisely there. Father said the notch was there because a knife had once wanted too much. He said it with recognition in his voice, as though it concerned good craftsmanship rather than accident. I noted, sharpness is a decision. Who makes it once must make it again and again. Behind the house lay the yard, a square of ill-tempered stones that did not fit well together. In one corner stood a pump that creaked like old pine in winter, but in spring gave water that carried the taste of earth. Beside it, the ropes where washing hung, educated by the air. Stockings that collected sounds, shirts that learnt light externally. I liked the yard for its lines. The pump's shadow fell exactly to the 3rd flagstone in the morning, exceeded it by half in the afternoon. The world had directions it did not hide. On the first day of spring, which brought more promise than warmth, I found at the threshold a small grey ball, a bird that no longer comprehended flying for a while. The neighbour's cat had likely tested it and left it lying. It still breathed, quick as a clock that wants too much. Mother said I should take it away, so it might have its peace. I took it in my hands. Its breastbone tapped my fingers, small, polite, persistent beats. Behind the barn, my knees settled into the damp ground, and I watched it. I saw how the eye knew not what to do with the world. I laid it upon the warm stone and waited until the clock within it no longer erred. It was a short path from there to the knife, not from cruelty, but from order. A body has doors. This I had learnt at the market. They are small, but they can be found if one remains calm. In the kitchen lay the short knife with the wooden handle. I asked nothing. I guided the blade beneath the skin, as the man at the table with the channel had done, only more carefully. And the skin yielded like damp cloth. There was not much blood, merely a hint, metallic, warm, a greeting to the air. I wished to know where the heart dwelt, and I found it not, but I found that feathers have a will that expresses itself even in death. They return to order when one strokes them. Mother saw it and said nothing. She watched me long, then placed the knife in water, as though it had worked and deserved rest. Later, she bound together the day's wound by spreading a piece of bread thinly with treacle and pretending there was sweetness. I took it gladly. Sweetness is a brief peace. Longer it never becomes. The grammar of precision. Father built the shed behind the pump to keep the wood dry. He worked as he always worked, with a gaze that found the line first, then the tool. I handed him nails, and he held them between lips that did not consider whether they liked metal. "Look here," he said, "not at the hand, at the path it must take." He struck, and the nail did what was expected. When it slipped, he laughed and said wood was stubborn when one did not meet it properly. He struck again, and the wood understood. Once he cut himself. No cry, only a sharp intake and the observation, "Blunt, my fault." I noted the sequence of sentences. Responsibility is quieter than pain. I drew the house, not with chalk, we had little, with a piece of slate I found behind the barn. The lines ran where the floorboards willed them. I mapped the hall, the stairs, the kitchen, the yard. I placed small crosses at places that spoke when no one expected it. The fifth step that complained. The beam that spoke of its own accord in damp weather. The bolt that closed properly only with patience. Then I put the map away, because the map is not the house, but merely its assertion. I preferred the original, with all its faults and truths that it exhaled in winter. In the village there were boys who wanted nothing good. They stood at the corner where the lane widens and the hedge begins, and they threw words. Words have weight when one throws them at someone, heavier than stones when one is small. I did not gather them up. I let them fall. One day they took the youngest trader's cap and would not return it. The boy stood there with a forehead that saw too much sky. I went to the lads and asked for the cap, without asking. They laughed, and one wanted to strike my hand. He did not strike. I stepped half a pace aside and saw how his arm sought the space and found it not. He reddened. The space grew smaller. I said, "Order is when each has what belongs to him." This pleased them not, but the cap pleased them even less, so they surrendered it. It was worthy of no hero. It was merely a sentence that wished to be spoken to its end. Evenings I carved soap. Mother had a piece, too old for washing, too new for throwing away. I took the paring knife and guided the blade so it did not jump. Narrow curls fell from the edge and lay like tiny scrolls upon the table. I practiced angles until the hand knew them without the eyes needing to ask. Once I slipped and cut a notch too deep. I pushed it to the edge and pretended it belonged there. Not every truth wishes to be in the center. The anatomy of understanding. There were days when Father returned early, and the light was still behind the houses when he entered the yard. On such evenings he brought things. A piece of leather to mend an apron, a handful of nails in a cloth. Once the head of a pig, because the butcher did him a favor. He laid it upon the table, and the table did its duty. The eyes saw nothing that remained to be seen. I saw the seam behind the ear, there where the skin would lay itself aside like cloth if one knew the proper grip. "See here," said father, "here the hand decides, not the knife." He drew his thumb across the edge of bone. It sounded like a quiet string. The lane was a different creature in nights. It lay still, as though someone had oiled its joints. One heard the river behind the fields, a very deep tone that emerged only when the wind was weary. Sometimes I went outside, sat upon the threshold, and let coldness rise into my fingers. A man passed by, a wanderer with a pan upon his back that stole the moon from him when he passed beneath the hedge. He saw me and nodded. Nodding is the most polite of all conversations. At the corner of the lane stood a juniper. It was no beautiful tree, it merely liked to stand. In its shadow I found one day a fox that no longer ran. The flies had already registered their first claim. I took a stick and turned the head carefully, not from kindness but to understand the lines. The teeth stood well. They were honest, small, and determined. I considered whether I should take something, a tooth perhaps, a remnant of fur. I left everything. The boundary between curiosity and collecting is thin, but it exists. I wished to know the boundary. Mother held the house. She did it as others hold breath when they must go underwater. One does not see it in them, but one hears when their breath gives out. On days when the washing would not dry because the wind refused to take anything, she stood in the yard and held the ropes fast with glances. When she laughed, one thought of Grace. When she was silent, something shifted in the walls, as though they must make room for the silence. Once, late, I heard a cup break upon the stone. No word afterwards, only the grinding sound when shards are gathered into an orderly handful. Order is the sound things make when they stop hurting. The lessons of violence. The church spoke of sin and penance as though they were spices one could sprinkle according to need. I sat beneath and listened to wood that aged, whilst we pretended eternity would be impressed. The vicar once looked at me long, longer than was polite. Later he spoke to father, and father said afterwards only, "He means well. Good intentions are wood that splinters quickly." I let it lie. I preferred what had edges and admitted it. In the lower chamber, beneath the steps, was a room that did not like to be entered. There the air smelled of damp and of something I later learnt was mold. Father kept there things that belonged to the future, boards that were not yet walls, jars that had no jam yet, a sack of lime that wished to become a wall. I sometimes sat within when the house was too loud. Beneath the steps I heard how people walk without observing themselves. It is the most honest gait. One lifts feet because one must, not because one is seen. I imagined how the house recorded our steps in its own chronicle, a story that would never be read aloud. The rats belonged to the house like mortar. Father set traps that clicked when no one thought of them. Once I sat beside when it, and saw how the creature, still warm, ordered the world within itself and found it no more. I took up the trap, released the small machine, held the rat by its tail, which felt like wet rope, and laid it upon the stone in the yard. There was no reason for celebration. I took the blade. The skin let itself be drawn if one lifted it at the proper place. It was work, no spectacle. The smell came, as always, briefly and without shame. I learnt to be swift. Slowness is cruelty when the matter is decided. One night father came very late, and the house was a boat in rough water. He spoke too loudly, and words stumbled into the hall. Mother placed herself in his way, not with hands, with gaze. There were no blows. There was the possibility of blows, which stood in the room like a knife upon the table that no one touches. I held my breath until the room decided to allow breathing again. The next morning the hall was cleaned. The small stain at the skirting told not whence it came. No question was asked. Questions are knives for people who cannot hold them. The mathematics of Death Spring carried the house a piece further away from what it had been in winter. The tone of the floorboards changed. The windows let light in through different sentences. One afternoon, when the water in the pump was softer than usual, the man with the basket came through the lane who brought rabbits. He stopped halfway because a boy, Not I, held the creature too roughly. The man took it from him, stroked its neck, found the line where the body showed its readiness, and ended what had been begun. The air was very still in that moment, as though it held the image fast, to sort it later. I looked without staring. I took away what was not needed. What remained was technique. The small, dry sound, the angle of the hand. One must know lines. Otherwise one does much and achieves little. The man's hands moved with the certainty of repeated practice. I observed how his thumb found the precise point where skull met spine, how his fingers positioned themselves to deliver swift conclusion. There was no hesitation, no excess motion. The rabbit's eyes remained open, but the light in them simply departed, like a candle flame when the wick is pinched. I thought of doors again, how some open inward, others outward, and the wise man knows which is which before he turns the handle. Later, when the man had gone, and the lane had settled back into its afternoon rhythm, I found myself thinking of the sound, that brief, soft snap that marked the boundary between breathing and not breathing. It was a sound I would hear again, in different circumstances, with different subjects. But the principle remained constant. Find the line, apply pressure precisely, allow nature to complete what technique begins. "You see too much," Mother said once. "No," I said. "I see correctly." She tilted her head and laughed with a sound that might have belonged to another woman, one who knew more sleep. "Correctly is a question of light," she said. I knew she was right, because she seldom spoke sentences one needed to remember, and when she did, only such as these. The architecture of silence. Evenings. I sometimes sat at the door and let the last gully of dusk run over the lane. When the baker brought his cart home, the world was complete for a breath's length. Wood that speaks, iron that answers, water that decides, air that holds everything together. I thought then, not of God nor of sin. I thought of how useful it is to know where things yield, and how important it is to keep the hands steady when the rest of the world is not. The house taught me that observation must be methodical. Each room had its own language. The kitchen spoke of necessity, the parlor of appearances kept for visitors who rarely came. The stairs were a vocabulary of complaint, each board contributing its own note to the symphony of settlement and age. I learnt to read these signs as others read printed words. The creak that announced father's return. The sigh that meant mother paused in her endless mending. The tick of cooling wood that marked the day's end. In the barn behind the house, I discovered a different kind of education. Mice nested in the straw, their movements creating a constant whisper of small urgencies. I would sit quietly in the corner, hardly breathing, watching their patterns. They had highways invisible to larger eyes, routes determined by scent and memory rather than sight. When I caught one, and I became quite skilled at this, I would examine its construction with the same attention father gave to his carpentry. The mouse was a lesson in efficiency, no wasted space, every part purposeful. The heart, when I found it, was smaller than a pea, but beat with desperate intensity. I learnt to locate it quickly. Time was always a factor in these investigations. The blade had to be precisely positioned, the cut deliberate. Hesitation served no one, least of all the subject. The clockwork of consequence. The village clock struck hours with a voice that brooked no argument. I began to time my activities by its pronouncements, learning to complete tasks within the boundaries it set. This was another form of precision, temporal rather than spatial, but requiring the same discipline of hand and mind. Mrs. Hartwell's passing in late winter had left her cottage empty. Sometimes I would stand at its gate, observing how quickly a house begins to forget its inhabitants. The garden grew wild with surprising speed. The windows accumulated grime that filtered light into something grey and undecided. I thought of the mice in our barn, how quickly they moved to fill any vacancy, and wondered what manner of life would eventually claim Mrs. Hartwell's rooms. The cottage gave me ideas about impermanence. Everything that seemed solid, walls, foundations, the heavy oak door that had once kept out wind and strangers, was merely temporarily arranged. Given time, water would find the smallest gap. Frost would widen it, and what had once sheltered human dreams would return to earth and timber. This was neither sad nor frightening. It was simply true, like gravity or the need for air. Father found me studying the empty cottage one morning. He stood beside me for several minutes, following my gaze to the sagging roofline, the paintwork beginning to peel around the window frames. "Nothing lasts," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "But some things last longer than others. Aye, and some things make their mark before they go." I stored this conversation carefully, sensing weight in his words that I was not yet equipped to fully understand. But I grasped the essential principle. Duration mattered less than impact. A sharp blade cutting once could achieve more than a dull one sawing endlessly.
I trust you enjoyed this glimpse into a most curious diary. If so, leave behind a small token of your delight with a like, and do consider joining our circle by subscribing. And remember, ring the little bell, and you shall be the very first to know when another diary or a fresh entry emerges from the shadows. And if a whisper stirs in your mind, a thought, a riddle, perhaps a name of someone whose secrets you would dare to uncover, leave it for me below. I read them one by one. And who knows, your wish may guide my hand to the very next diary I choose from my collection.